Simply because I enjoy being a contrarian, today I wanted to discuss how games can be made or broken for the people playing them solely based on what happens when they temporarily stop. That's right, today we're diving into the thrilling world of pause screens, and the lack thereof, particularly in single-player games. Also, just because I love throwing in explanatory side comments whenever possible, I understand you could hit the PS button or whatever the analog is on another system and achieve the desired effect that way. I'm talking about features that are baked into the programming. On the whole, pause screens are common in single-player experiences. With a few notable exceptions, even if the whole environment doesn't halt at your behest, most games will allow you to hit a pause button at whichever time you'd like, for better or worse. Obviously, simplicity varies, and some pause screens are quite beautiful and manage to maintain the mood of the game even when you do have to step away for a second. Perhaps that could be a topic for another video if I remember to do that later, and it's still interesting to me. At any rate, while it is true that I'm playing devil's advocate for a relatively uncommon experience here, and not only that, but also not talking about pausing multiplayer games at all, this should not be allowed, I still want to take the time to examine both sides of the pause coin anyway. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a pause as No, I'm just kidding, I'm not doing that garbage. One of my personal favorite directors and all-around very eccentric guys, David Lynch, once said, if you're oh my god, it's not even working a little bit, I promise I actually like him. If you're playing the movie on a telephone, you will never in a trillion years experience the film. You'll think you've experienced it, but you'll be cheated. It's such a sadness that you think you've seen a film on your fucking telephone. Get real. Much as it pains me to even possibly be labeled as pretentious, I do kind of have to agree, at least insofar as it relates to watching films. I get where he's coming from. Forsaking convenience for the overall level of immersion, it's not hard to realize that sitting in a darkened theater with a massive screen and huge speakers brings you into the experience more than looking at it on a tiny, perhaps smudged, perhaps cracked phone screen. While true that a theater provides a purer viewing experience, it's also more than a little presumptuous of the creator to assume that any given viewer can drop everything and have the resources necessary to see any new movie's theatrical release. And yet Nicole Kidman would be very sad if you didn't show up to your local spot, so that obviously totally supersedes convenience, and that's why we all only watch movies in theaters now. Films, by and large, unless you're stumbling into some adaptive, different every time art house thing in a gallery or a choose-your-own-adventure sort of deal, follow a set structure as established during the creative process. By the time it gets to you, the plot is already set, the color grading is done, the edits are made, and everyone who's been involved in the final production or has seen it before you knows when all of the beats take place. With the exception of final cuts or director's cuts or Snyder cuts or whatever, when you decide you'd like to take in a movie, then decide to rewatch it months or years later, although your reactions may vary, the on-screen experience will remain structurally identical. You might be on a flight and decide to pass the time with a familiar favorite rather than risk not hearing important dialogue because there's a screeching child on the flight, or because the screen quality is just that bad. Makes sense. But it does also make sense to see a new movie on the airplane if you just feel like watching a movie and have limited options. Much like many authors dread getting the beach read label, I expect the airplane movie label stings many directors. However, it's still foolish to think that art like commercially released movies can only be experienced under a specific set of circumstances. Video games, meanwhile, are a whole other beast. Unlike the predetermined experience of a film with a set start and end time, even the simplest video games offer an amazing range of experiential variation, both from player to player and playthrough to playthrough. When the player is in control, they are fully within their ludic rights to speedrun, move the player character forward one step at a time with 10 seconds between each step, or anything in between. Even with the knowledge of future scripted events or overarching plot elements, it can be quite hard to pin down when a particular event or story beat takes place in a game if you aren't taking great care to keep track. Is it fair, then, to have a player forced to comply with a no-pause rule when they're unsure of when their experience is even supposed to end or reach a particular point in the narrative? Keeping in mind that the average game is likely longer than the average film by a wide margin, is it really practical to prevent the player from having a moment to complete a real-life task simply because you as the creator feel that a pause feature would dilute the narrative or artistic experience? Let's cover some theoretical reasons why you'd want to force a player to maintain focus. You might have a striking cutscene which adds value to the experience, either in its beauty, uniqueness, importance to the plot, or perhaps by adding a moment of characterization for a protagonist. You can almost treat it like a small movie and realize that, okay, watching a cutscene is basically a microcosm of watching a movie, and the creators want you to experience that in a particular predetermined way. It's hard to argue that a few minutes of your attention is too much to ask when you've quite possibly been playing the game for hours already. So, case 1, cutscene/little movie. Outside of a cutscene, though the motivations could also of course overlap, you might want to maintain tension in a high-stakes or horror scenario. It would totally ruin the trepidation a player built up if they paused a second before something big and frightening was supposed to pop out, would frustrate them if upon resuming they were instantly jump-scared because of an unlucky pause location, or it might turn a suspiciously quiet hallway into a boring one, provided no scripted events or dangerous entities actually existed there in the first place. So, case 2, maintain tension. Case 3. You might have a scenario where a player has to complete a task in a certain amount of time. You could call this the Monster Hunter World example. If the in-game clock is paused when the player pauses, you're arguably giving them time to cheat by looking up directions or a walkthrough instead of trying to figure out the situation at hand. I suppose I could also call this the Portal 1 example. No spoils, so no context, but if you understand my point, you know which spot I'm talking about here. Case 3. Maintain urgency, time limit. Case 4. The whole experience as it is designed merits continuous focus throughout, either because it's a short game like a before your eyes sort of deal, where you control the story by blinking in real time to impact the experience, or a really long game chasing a specific flavor of artistic rumination like The Longing, which takes 400 real-world days to complete. I'm in the video games are art and this is a tired argument camp, so don't take this as implication that more traditionally paced games aren't equally valid pieces of art. But games such as these are really striving to create robust and thoughtful artistic experiences. So let's call that for the sake of art. Case 4, for the sake of art. Case 4, the sake of art. You could continue to come up with reasons why pausing would be a bad idea, but I think this is a solid foundation to justify not including a pause feature in your game. With that being said, let's take the time to go through a couple of examples before we discuss the alternative viewpoint. If I ask a group of radical gamers, #allgame_no-sleep, #gaming, what came to mind when I said tell me a single-player game with no pausing? A FromSoft game will likely come up first. When it comes to FromSoft games, with Bloodborne being the main example for me because I have a soft spot for no spoils for settings like that, but equally relevant for all of the Dark Souls games, Elden Ring, etc., I understand how incorporating a specific pause screen acts in opposition to the overall tone of learn the environment by exploring and dying repeatedly until you figure out how to parry some number of hours in or never. So, I suppose we could call that a sort of case 2/4. Monster Hunter we've already discussed a little bit. Monster Hunter World doesn't allow pausing, but is also a drop-in, drop-out multiplayer with a lot of timed quests. I've spent most of my time playing as a single player so that I don't end up with someone else coming in and hurting a precious, enormous lizard on my watch. I accept that my character will just stand around in a field or a forest or something while I go to grab a drink, and if I get annihilated by a different enormous lizard, so be it. Such is the nature of things, may the enormous lizard feed well. Even though it has the whole multiplayer element going for it, let's call Monster Hunter World a case 3 to simplify things. Of important note though, Monster Hunter Rise does feature a pause screen. While writing up the script for this video, but I already had this idea, thank you very much, I came across an article on PlayStationLife.net where a dev for the Dead Space remake that recently released at time of recording specifically mentioned how removing a pause ability could make the game more impactful. They ended up not going with this, by the way. You can pause in the remake. Joel McMillan stated in an interview that having a pause feature in games without persistent online functionality, aka single-player games, could, quote, deflate some of the tension and that, quote, you would truly feel like you're never actually safe. That's a case 2 to the T right there, folks. Trepidation totally trounced by tension termination. Now that we've thoroughly justified why lacking a pause function might be a benefit to player experience, let's discuss the alternative.